Welcome back to Africa This Week. It was that time of the year when the world virtually converges in one place as politics meets business, rhetorics inspire decisions, with bilateral handshakes extending towards smiling faces between deafening silence and rousing applause. Instituted in 1945, the General Assembly is the biggest annual gathering of principal actors and global spectators, hoping to tackle humanity's greatest challenges, with African leaders not left out of the global equation for diplomatic interaction. Now, joining me in the studio to dig deep on Africa This Week is Tosin Akonde, a lawyer and political analyst. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
It's all right.
Now, this year marked the 72nd United Nations General Assembly. What do you think is in it for Africa?
For Africa, the constant thing that's always been in it is that African nations, so far, at least as at the last 72nd GA, will continue to be receiver nations. We are not major players yet on the global world map. And it's just my sincere hope that an African leader of repute, the one that has the consciousness of the African people, will arise someday from any of the nations of Africa and help put Africa where it indeed belongs.
Indeed belongs. Well, the theme for this year was and still remains focusing on people striving for peace and a decent life for all on a sustainable planet. How relevant is it going by recent developments in Africa?
Well, as far as Africa is concerned, like I said earlier, you see, that defines our roles. We are not major players. So if you say how relevant is that theme to African nations, we will continue to implement only what has been done by the US of this world and so on and so forth. But if you ask, that question is more relevant for the US, for instance. You've seen President Macron of France appealing diplomatically, because I know in his closet he would be mad with Trump. So what's wrong with this guy? This decision wasn't taken by the US alone. It was the US, the G8, and so many other nations. And here is Donald Trump threatening to boycott. He has described that agreement with Iran as an embarrassment to the US. And indeed, he himself has become an embarrassment to the entire world. So these are the emerging issues, the evolving issues. Africa continues sadly to play the receiver. You know, look, for instance, I expect that with the kind of foreign policy we have as outlined in Section 19 of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, we should be talking about having meetings with representatives of countries like Russia, countries like China, countries like the US. You know, of course, we saw the headlines of most, the front page banners of most of the print media. And it might interest you that, as far as I am concerned, I'm not being unnecessarily critical of the president or our foreign policy. But I think the picture shows our president as soapy, shows him as more or less having an inferior stance, the body language to that of Donald Trump. It shouldn't be so. In diplomatic relations, countries should stand eyeball to eyeball, shoulder to shoulder. The president of Nigeria is no less in any reckoning with the president of the US, however big their country appears to loom large. So these are the germane issues. We were meeting Ghana by the sideline of the United Nations General Assembly, and we think that's an achievement. Ghana, that is next door neighbor.
Next door to us.
Okay, so that's no achievement. We're meeting countries like Jordan, and then they are giving us one or two kinds of assistance. I mean, it's all Bangladesh. Our foreign policy needs to be elevated to where it was in those days when Idi Agbon would say we'll ground the BA, and it will be grounded and nothing will happen.
All right, what's your take on the UN's reaction to North Korea's ballistic missiles?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, I need to be very open and honest. I haven't read up on the latest reactions of the United Nations, but I know for sure that Pyongyang has reacted. Venezuelan head of state has also rightly, in my humble opinion, reacted by describing Trump as the new face of Hitler in world politics. So, truth be told, diplomatically, this issue has to be resolved. China has to wade in. Russia has to wade in. The president's stance, the president let me not say the US foreign policy. The Trumpist foreign policy needs to be, re-engineered, worked upon. I understood from, background research that his speech writers asked him that, dear President, sir, why not let's edit out some of this harsh language? He said, no, he wanted it that way. Exactly. So I won't describe what he said as the American foreign policy. And I hope the Russia, the China, and the Germanys of this world will see it in that light. This is a Trumpist ideal and not the American ideal.
No. The question wasn't actually the U.S., but the UN.
I said I'm not aware of the latest reaction of the UN. But then what really can the UN as a body do? You know the way the politics of the Committee of Nations goes. It's whatever those top 5 says, not really the UN. If the UN were...
Is just sanctions enough?
Yes, they should be. If they have placed sanctions, they should be. But then, if you place sanctions, you don't speak from both sides of the mouth like the UN appears to be doing over the years.
Indeed.
You don't speak sanctions, and then Russia independently or China on its own goes behind and begins to lend support. Then you say technically, whatever action you want to take is vetoed. So I am not aware of any sanctions so far.
All right, what are your thoughts on the role of the United Nations in tackling the humanitarian crisis now and the famine in countries like South Sudan and the Central African Republic?
Well, to be honest with you, they've done so much. There's the UN Commission on Refugees, the UNHCR, and so on and so forth. They've done a few things. It's just that the way it is in Africa, we've never complimented the efforts of the rest of the world. You know, for instance, at the African region, you heard Trump saying that they've done so much, but to stop, if you notice in his speech, I listened with rapt attention. He never said anything about Africa until he started talking about mass migration. Okay, so that is the relevant thing to him as far as Africa was concerned. They were sending in people and sending in people. Look, you people, we've given a lot of aids. Your government should be responsible enough to convert those aids, you know, into something meaningful for you.
And indeed they should.
So that is the problem. Africa has never lived up, has never complemented what the rest of the world are doing. Locally, let's bring it home. You heard what happened at the IDP camps, where bags of rice meant for people who are stressed, people who are displaced, people who are stranded, are being stolen. You know, so I mean, Africa is a laughable thing. So we hope somebody will just get up and get all these things together. There is a foreign policy for Nigeria on paper. I mentioned earlier section 19, which identifies Nigeria first, the ECOWAS sub-region next, the Africans before the world at large. But we are not doing it that way. Practically speaking, our leaders will go out, get stuff from the US, or we call them Uncle Sam. Specifically speaking, in foreign relations, US is called Uncle Sam. Because they have this uncle status for nearly all the nations of the world. So we go cap in hand, begging for instructions on what to do. It's not supposed to be so. Okay,
now how should the United Nations General Assembly address issues like the human rights violations, the democratic governance, migration, terrorism, gender equality, and youth empowerment in Africa?
What they have done so far over the last few years is what they only need to do better, because they've set up a lot of other agencies. You know, the FAO, for instance, is an affiliate or sister organization to the UN, the UNCHR, and so on and so forth, UNESCO, UNICEF, and that's all. And they fund all these organizations. The only problem...
They are all names. Do they have that much impact?
Like we said earlier in our interview, they make funds available to African governments, but those funds never get to be implemented for the purpose for which they were released.
Intended.
You know, they were intended. So it's an unfortunate thing, and that's why all those things. You see, if you impose sanctions, for instance, on nations that are erring, on nations that are not cooperative, it will go a long way. But like I told you, in international politics, the force of law is not really in what the UN says, but what the top 5 says. That's the Security Council.
All right, now, what key areas should the United Nations focus on to achieve sustainable development in Africa?
They'll keep partnering with our governments, and they need to understand our component structure. Maybe I would love to see a situation where a UN agency is working directly with local government councils, because these funds, if you work at the federal government level, it never permeates down to the grassroots, to the real people for whom these funds are released. So I envisage a situation where the UN takes cognizance of the peculiar internal arrangement, the internal makeup of individual nations, and begin to work with those people at the grassroots. I'm sure that's going to be very, very unwelcome news to the federal government.
All right, away from all the aid we get now, what are the challenges the United Nations has with respect to peacekeeping in Africa?
Challenges that they have with peacekeeping is that we seem not to be able to put all these wars in check. That's the only challenge, because you have crisis-prone Africa, owing to differences in language, ethnicity, religion, creed, and what have you. So these are some of the things that make the African continent highly volatile. You go for elections, it's inconclusive, we go to war. So that's the challenge, honestly, because apart from that, there are other regions of the world that are not as prone to crisis as Africa is. So what is it that the UN agencies are doing that is right? The problem is our peculiarity. Until we begin to understand life from each other's perspective and we begin to build, nation building is a communal thing. It's not seen from the racial point of view or ethnic point of view. For instance, there's a certain category of people here in this country who believe that it's their birthright to continue to rule, and then they say they are born to rule. So every other person is also born to rule. When we reorientate our minds, I'm sure we're going to find it more easy. We'll be less problematic for agencies of the UN.
Well, in short, Africa simply has to get a grip.
Seriously.
Tosia Konde, lawyer, political analyst, thank you for being here today.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Well, at the risk of becoming another talk show rather than a defining moment, the 72nd United Nations General Assembly comes at a time when nations need to become more united in a sense of purpose to make the world a better place for future generations. Africa, on its own part, must now go from the status of abundant resources to a level efficient resourcefulness, where leaders create building blocks of prosperity for the good of humanity. I have been your guide, Fadisha Lashotingwa. Many thanks for watching, and bye for now.